On a Saturday morning in April of 1974, in Fillmore County, Nebraska, a man named August Brenner raised his hand at a county land auction and bought 50 acres of ground that nobody else in the room wanted. The auctioneer had started the bidding at $400 an acre and worked his way down over the course of 20 minutes through $300, through $250, through $220, until he reached $200 and stopped calling for more because the room had gone quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when the people in them have collectively decided that something is not worth their time. August raised his hand at $200 an acre. Total price, $10,000. Cash, from a savings account he'd been building for 11 years. The men around him in the auction barn did not react the way men react when someone makes a bold move. They reacted the way men react when someone makes a mistake in public and they're not sure whether to say something or let it go. A few of them looked at each other. A few of them looked at August. Phil Davenport, who farmed 600 acres of Class 1 soil 3 miles south and had not bid on this parcel because he'd looked at it twice and decided it wasn't worth the trouble of hauling equipment to, leaned over to the man beside him and said something that August heard clearly because the barn had gone quiet enough to hear it. Phil said, "August Brenner just paid $10,000 for 50 acres of hardpan and disappointment." The man beside Phil laughed. The auctioneer's assistant wrote August's name on the sales sheet. August walked to the table, wrote a check, shook the auctioneer's hand, and drove out to look at what he'd bought. He stood at the edge of the 50 acres for a long time in the April light. What he saw was not promising by any conventional measure. The ground was pale, almost gray in places, the color soil gets when the organic matter has been farmed out of it over decades of aggressive tillage and heavy chemical inputs with no attention paid to what was being taken out compared to what was being put back. There were places where the clay subsoil had come to the surface, slick and impermeable, the color of old putty. There were places where the topsoil, what remained of it, was less than 2 inches deep over a hardpan layer that a tillage implement would hit like concrete at 4 inches down. There were erosion channels on the slight slope to the east, where water had been running off instead of soaking in for so many years that the channels had become permanent features of the landscape. The previous owner, a man named Carlson, who had farmed it as part of a larger operation for 20 years and had finally given up trying to make it produce anything worth the input costs, had told the auctioneer simply that the ground was worn out. That was the polite version. The extension agent in Geneva, a man named Howard Fitch, who had tested the soil 2 years earlier at Carlson's request, had written in his report that the organic matter content was 0, 8%. The pH was severely imbalanced at 5.2. The available phosphorus was negligible, and the soil structure was, in his professional assessment, essentially destroyed. Howard Fitch had used the words biologically dead in his report. And those words had traveled around Fillmore County the way words travel in small counties until most of the farmers who might have considered the parcel had heard them and decided accordingly. August Brenner had read Howard Fitch's report. He had driven out and walked the 50 acres before the auction. He had taken his own soil samples and sent them to a laboratory in Lincoln. He had done all of this not to confirm that the ground was as bad as everyone said it was, but to understand precisely how bad it was and in what specific ways, because August had a theory about dead soil that he had been developing for several years, and that he believed the 50 acres in Fillmore County might be exactly the right place to test. Let me tell you about August Brenner, because you need to understand the man before you can understand the decision he made and the patience with which he pursued it. August was 38 years old in 1974. He had grown up on his family's 180 acres in Fillmore County, the son of a German immigrant named Carl Brenner, who had come to Nebraska in 1928 and had spent the Depression years farming with methods that were not modern, even then. Carl had used horses until 1952. He had composted his livestock manure and returned it to his fields every year because it was the only fertility source he could afford, and because his father in Germany had done the same thing, and the fields had stayed productive through generations of continuous cropping as a result. He had never used anhydrous ammonia because he didn't trust what he didn't understand, and the chemistry of synthetic nitrogen was something Carl Brenner did not understand, and was not interested in learning. Carl's fields were dark, darker than his neighbor's fields, darker than the county average, darker than the soil map suggested they should be given their classification. Howard Fitch had tested Carl's soil in 1961, the same year he'd been testing soils across the county as part of an extension service survey, and had found organic matter at 5.8% on ground that the soil survey classified as capable of supporting 4.2% under good management. Howard had written a note in his survey file that Carl Brenner's fields were the best managed soil he'd measured in Fillmore County that year, and that the management system, which appeared to be based on livestock manure application and minimal tillage by the standards of the era, deserved further study. August had grown up watching his father do things that were considered old-fashioned by the farming community around them, and that produced results that the farming community around them could not entirely explain. He had asked Carl about it when he was old enough to ask real questions, and Carl had answered in the way that men answer when they have thought about something for a long time and reduced it to its essential form. Carl had said, "The soil is alive. Everything alive needs to be fed. If you feed the soil life feeds your crops. If you stop feeding the soil life, it dies. And when it dies, your crops have nothing to draw from except what you pour on from a bag. And what you pour on from a bag costs money, and what the soil life provides costs nothing except the attention to put it back." August had carried that understanding with him through his adult life. Through the years when the extension agents were talking about yield maximization and input efficiency and economies of scale, through the years when his neighbors were trading their manure spreaders for anhydrous applicators and their two-row cultivators for broad-spectrum herbicide programs. He had continued farming the way Carl had taught him, with manure and rotation and attention to what his soil was telling him, and his yields had been consistent and his input costs had been low and his ground had stayed dark in a county where ground was getting paler every decade. By 1974, he had a theory that went beyond what Carl had taught him, informed by reading he had been doing for years in publications that most Fillmore County farmers did not read. A journal called Compost Science. Early publications from the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania that he ordered directly because the county library didn't carry them. A book by a British agronomist named Sir Albert Howard called An Agricultural Testament, published in 1940, that a professor at the University of Nebraska had recommended to August when August had driven to Lincoln specifically to talk to someone who knew soil science at a level beyond what the county extension office provided. The theory was this: soil that had been described as biologically dead was not actually dead in the way that a stone is dead. It was depleted. It had been farmed in ways that removed organic matter faster than it was replaced, that disrupted the biological communities in the soil with tillage and chemicals, that allowed the physical structure to degrade through compaction and erosion, but depleted was not the same as destroyed. The organisms that made soil alive, the bacteria and fungi and earthworms and the complex communities they formed, were not gone from depleted soil. They were reduced, suppressed, surviving at levels too low to do the work that healthy populations could do. And reduced populations, given the right conditions, could recover. The right conditions were the same conditions Carl had used on his fields for 40 years. Organic matter returned to the soil in quantities sufficient to feed the biological community. Tillage reduced to levels that allowed the physical structure to rebuild. Chemical inputs reduced to levels that stopped suppressing the biology. Time, because biology does not recover on a quarterly earnings schedule, but on the schedule of living systems, which is patient and cumulative and ultimately more powerful than any intervention a farmer with a checkbook can buy. August believed that 50 acres of biologically dead soil in Fillmore County, Nebraska, managed correctly over a sufficient period of time, could be brought back to productivity that would surprise everyone who had written it off. He had $10,000 in savings and a theory and a patience that came from watching his father farm the same way for 30 years and seeing the results accumulate slowly. And then, in the later years, abundantly, he bought the 50 acres. Before we go further, I want you to stay with me on this, because what August Brenner did over the following 12 years was not dramatic in the way farming stories are sometimes dramatic. There was no single moment of crisis and resolution. There was no corporation to fight and defeat. There was just a man and 50 acres of pale, exhausted ground and a systematic, patient application of everything he understood about what soil needed to come back to life. Subscribe if you haven't already. These farming stories are the ones worth staying for, because the lesson inside this one is the kind that changes how you see things permanently. The first thing August did in the spring of 1974 was nothing. He did not plow, he did not disc, he did not apply any fertilizer or any herbicide or any input of any kind. He looked at the ground and he let it rest for one season, because his first assessment was that the soil structure was so damaged that any tillage would make it worse before it made it better, and because he needed to understand the field's drainage patterns and moisture distribution before he began working it. He walked the 50 acres every week through that first spring and summer in all weather conditions, carrying a soil probe and a notebook. He mapped the wet areas and the dry areas, the places where water pooled after rain and the places where it ran off, the places where the hardpan was shallowest, and the places where there was a foot or more of degraded topsoil still present. He took soil samples from 22 different points and had them all analyzed, building a map of the field's condition that was more detailed than anything Howard Fitch's survey had provided. What he found confirmed the laboratory results, but added spatial detail that the laboratory couldn't provide. The field was not uniformly bad. The worst ground was on the slight eastern slope, where erosion had removed most of the topsoil over decades of row cropping without adequate cover. The best ground, such as it was in the lower northwest corner, where water collected and organic matter from the eroded areas had deposited over the years. In the northwest corner, organic matter was 1.4%. On the eastern slope, it was 4%, a number so low that Howard Fitch's instruments had initially questioned whether the reading was accurate. August spent the fall of 1974 doing the first active intervention. He hauled manure, not from his own operation, which was too small to supply what he needed, but from a dairy farmer named Weston, who operated a 200 cow operation 6 miles away, and who was always looking for someone to take his manure off his hands, because manure management on a 200 cow dairy was a perpetual logistical problem. August worked out an arrangement where he would haul Weston's manure at his own expense in exchange for the manure itself. He made 23 trips with his truck and manure spreader in September and October, applying an average of 12 tons per acre across the 50 acres, with emphasis on the worst ground on the eastern slope. 12 tons per acre of dairy manure was a heavy application by any standard. At that rate, the manure provided roughly 120 pounds of nitrogen, 60 pounds of phosphorus, and 80 pounds of potassium per acre, along with the organic matter itself, the billions of bacteria and fungi present in fresh manure, the complex carbon compounds that soil biology would process over the following months and years into the humus that was the foundation of genuine soil fertility. August did not expect to see results in year one. He told Phil Davenport this when Phil stopped at the fence line one October afternoon and looked at the manure-covered field with an expression that mixed curiosity with skepticism. Phil said, "You're putting dairy manure on ground that can't grow anything. What are you expecting to happen?" August said, "Not much this year. Maybe not much next year either." Phil said, "That's a lot of work for not much." August said, "I'm not farming years. I'm farming decades." Phil drove away, shaking his head. At the cafe in Geneva that evening, he reported that August Brenner had gone philosophical about his $10,000 mistake. In the spring of 1975, August seeded the 50 acres to a mixture of red clover, sweet clover, and brome grass. Not a cash crop, a biological intervention. The legumes would fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, adding fertility without cost. The roots of all three species would penetrate the hardpan layer, fracturing it with biological force that tillage could not replicate without destroying whatever structure remained. The above-ground biomass would shade the soil surface, reducing temperature extremes, reducing evaporation, and providing organic matter as the plants died back and decomposed. He did not harvest the clover and grass in 1975. He let it grow and mow it in late summer and leave the cuttings on the surface. He did not harvest it in 1976 either. He cut it twice that season and left the cuttings. In the fall of 1976, he made another round of manure applications, this time lighter, 8 tons per acre, because the biological activity in the soil had increased to the point where heavier applications would have exceeded what the recovering system could process effectively. Howard Fitch drove out in the fall of 1976 at August's invitation. He was skeptical, having written the biologically dead assessment 2 years earlier, but he was also a professional and a curious man, and he took the invitation seriously. He walked the field with August and took his own samples from the same 22 points August had sampled in 1974. The results were modest but real. Average organic matter across the field had risen from 0.8% to 1.3% in 2 years. The pH, which had been at 5.2 inches 1,974, had moved to 5.8, still low but moving in the right direction as the biological activity processed the manure and began producing the acids and bases that balance soil chemistry over time. The hardpan on the eastern slope had fractured in places where the clover roots had penetrated it, not dramatically, but measurably. Howard Fitch wrote in his notes that the trajectory was positive and that August's approach was producing results faster than he would have predicted. He did not share this assessment publicly. He was a careful man, and 2 years was not enough data to make a public statement that went against the biologically dead characterization he had put on record. But he drove back to Geneva thinking about Carl Brenner's dark fields, and about August standing in the October light telling Phil Davenport that he was farming decades. In 1977, August planted oats into the clover sod using a no-till drill he had borrowed from a farmer in the next county who had bought it experimentally and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. The oats germinated in the clover residue and produced a crop that was not spectacular by Fillmore County standards, but was real. 41 bushels per acre on ground that 2 years earlier had been classified as incapable of supporting economic production. August sold the oats, covered his seed cost and his hauling cost, and netted $180 from 50 acres of ground that Phil Davenport had described as hardpan and disappointment. It was not much, but it was proof that the direction was right. By 1979, 5 years into the restoration, August began rotating corn into the system. He planted 20 acres to corn that first year, leaving the remaining 30 inches a mix of clover and grass that he was using to build the worst ground on the eastern slope. The corn on the best recovered ground, the northwest corner, where organic matter had reached 2.8%, yielded 89 bushels per acre. The county average that year was 97. August was below average, but he was below average on ground that had been biologically dead 5 years earlier, and that his input cost was $28 per acre compared to the county average of $74. He told no one the yield numbers. He told no one the input costs. He kept his ledger and his soil test records and his notes, and he kept working the system he had designed, rotating crops, applying manure, seeding cover crops in the fall, reducing tillage year by year as the soil structure improved to the point where it no longer needed tillage to break compaction because the biological activity was managing the structure from inside. By 1981, the eastern slope that had been at 0.4% organic matter in 1974 was at 2.1%. The hardpan was breaking down under the combined action of roots and biology, and freeze-thaw cycling through soil that now held enough moisture to expand and contract meaningfully with temperature changes. August ran a chisel through it once that year, not to till it in the conventional sense, but to open channels that roots could follow deeper, and the chisel went through ground that had stopped a tillage implement at 4 inches in 1974 and went now to 14 inches without the hydraulics straining. Phil Davenport stopped at the fence line again in the fall of 1981. He had been watching the field from the road for 7 years, watching it go from gray hardpan to green cover crops to something that was beginning to look from the road like a real farm field. His own ground, which he had been farming with full conventional inputs since the 1960s, was producing good yields but requiring increasing amounts of fertilizer to maintain them, a pattern that his input supplier told him was normal and that August's reading told him was a sign of declining soil biology. Phil said, "Your ground is getting darker." August said, "It is." Phil said, "What are you putting on it?" August told him, "Manure, cover crops, reduced tillage, thyme." Phil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long before it's as dark as your father's ground?" August thought about it. "Another 5 years, he said. "Maybe 6. Phil drove away without saying anything about hardpan or disappointment. He was doing arithmetic of his own, the arithmetic of a man who is beginning to wonder whether the system he's been using is as good as he thought it was. In 1983, August Brenner's 50 acres produced corn at 118 bushels per acre. The county average was 112. For the first time since he had bought the ground 9 years earlier, his yield was above the county average. His input cost was $31 per acre. The county average was $89. Howard Fitch drove out that fall without being invited. He had been watching the soil test data that August had been sending him every 2 years since 1974, watching the numbers climb with a consistency that he had seen in research, literature, but had not previously witnessed in a field setting in Fillmore County. He walked the ground with August and took samples and said very little for 2 hours. When they got back to August's truck, Howard said, "I wrote Biologically Dead in 1972 about this ground. I need to tell you that I was wrong about what that meant. I meant it as a description of the current condition. You understood it as a description of potential. Those are different things, and you were right and I was wrong." August said, "You weren't wrong. It was biologically dead. It just wasn't permanently dead." Howard said, "That's the distinction I missed." He paused. "I'd like to write this up for the Extension Service, with your permission, not to make a case for anything controversial, just to document what happened here and what it took and how long it took, because farmers in this county are farming ground that is going in the direction yours was going in 1974. And they need to understand what the trajectory looks like if they don't change something." August said he didn't mind being written about as long as Howard wrote it accurately and didn't make it sound easier or faster than it had been. Howard wrote the Extension Bulletin in 1984. It was titled "Soil Organic Matter Restoration in Severely Depleted Agricultural Soils, a 10-year case study from Fillmore County." It described August's methods, his timeline, his soil test data from 1974 through 1983, and his yield and input cost comparisons against county averages. It was written in the careful, qualified language of extension publications, but the data told a story that did not require interpretation. A man had bought biologically dead soil for $200 an acre, applied a systematic biological restoration program over 10 years, and produced ground that was outperforming the county average at less than half the input cost. The bulletin was distributed to extension offices across Nebraska. A soil scientist at the University of Nebraska read it and drove to Fillmore County to meet August. A farmer in Saunders County called the extension office after reading it and asked for August's phone number. Then another farmer called. Then, a group of farmers from 3 counties drove out on a Saturday morning and stood at the edge of August's 50 acres and looked at ground that was now visibly darker than the fields around it, that stood green in dry Julys when neighboring fields were showing stress, that produced corn at costs that nobody who hadn't seen the numbers would have believed. By 1986, 12 years after the auction where Phil Davenport had said August had bought hardpan and disappointment, August Brenner's 50 acres had become something that nobody in Fillmore County had a word for. Not a demonstration farm, not a research plot. Just a working farm that produced more than it was supposed to from ground that everyone had agreed was finished, and that did it at costs that made the economics of conventional high-input farming look like an arrangement you accepted because you didn't know there was an alternative. Phil Davenport came to August's house in the spring of 1986 with a specific request. He said he wanted to know exactly what August had done, in what order, at what rates, over what timeline. He said he had 80 acres on the north end of his farm that were going pale and producing less every year despite increasing input rates, and that he was beginning to understand what that trajectory looked like if he didn't change something. August spent a Saturday afternoon with Phil walking through 12 years of record. The soil tests, the manure application rates, the cover crop species and seeding rates, the tillage reductions year by year, the yield data, and the input cost data side by side. Phil asked good questions. He had been farming long enough to understand what he was looking at, and what he was looking at was a systematic approach that had produced results he could not dismiss. At the end of the afternoon, Phil said, "I laughed at you at the auction, said you bought hardpan in disappointment." August said, "I know." Phil said, "I was wrong about the ground, and I was wrong about you." August said, "You were working with what you knew. The extension agents weren't teaching this, the dealers weren't selling it. I had access to information that most people in this county didn't have because I went looking for it. That's not your fault." Phil said, "It is a little bit my fault. I stopped being curious." August looked at him. He said, "Then start again." Phil started again. He seeded his 80 pale acres to clover in the fall of 1986. He made his first call to the dairy farmer, Weston, who by then had an established arrangement with August and was glad to have another customer for his manure. He reduced his tillage on those acres the following spring. He did not see results quickly, because results from this kind of work do not come quickly. And he knew that now in a way he had not known it in 1974 when he thought August was being philosophical about a mistake. August Brenner farmed his 50 acres until 2001, when his daughter, a woman named Clara, who had grown up watching her father walk that field every week with a soil probe and a notebook, took over the operation. The ground that August had bought for $200 an acre in 1974 was appraised in 2001 at $1,850 an acre. The organic matter content averaged 5.1% across the field, above the county average for Class 1 soil. The yield data for the previous 10 years showed consistent performance at or above county average at input costs that were less than half the county norm. Clara still farms it. She has added practices that August didn't use, more diverse cover crop mixes, biological inoculants that are now commercially available and that feed the soil communities in ways that complement the manure and rotation system her father built. She sends soil samples to the same laboratory in Lincoln that August used and compares the results to his 1,974 baseline in a chart she keeps on the wall of her office. The chart starts at 0.8% organic matter in 1974 and ends at the current measurement, which is just above 5.4%. The line is not straight. It rises slowly in the early years, faster in the middle years, and then levels off as the system approaches what the soil scientists call the steady state, the point at which organic matter inputs and outputs are in balance and the soil has reached its biological potential for that climate and that management system. Clara shows the chart to farmers who come to her farm, which they do regularly now, because word of what August built on 50 acres of biologically dead soil has traveled in the way that real results travel, slowly at first and then widely when enough people have seen the numbers. She explains the chart the way August explained things, simply, with reference to what the data shows rather than what she wants it to show. She says, "My father bought this ground when everyone said it was finished. He didn't think it was finished. He thought it was tired. He thought if you fed it what it needed and gave it the time it needed, it would come back. He was right. But it took 12 years to be right, in a way that anyone who hadn't been watching the whole time could see clearly." That's the part most people don't want to hear. Not that it's impossible, just that it takes longer than we're comfortable waiting. She pauses when she says it, the way people pause when they've said the thing they most want to say and they want to give it room to land. Then she says, "But 12 years is not forever. It just feels like it when you're standing at the beginning looking at gray ground and everyone around you is laughing. Now, let me say something before we close, something that I think is the real lesson underneath all the soil science and the yield numbers and the input cost comparisons. August Brenner was not a genius. He was not a scientist. He was a farmer's son who had watched his father do things the slow, careful, biological way, and had seen what that produced over 30 years of consistent application. He had read books and journals that most people around him had not read, not because he was exceptional, but because he was curious, and because he understood that the answers to the questions he was asking were not going to come from the people who were selling him inputs or the extension agents who were trained in the same conventional system that had produced the depleted ground he was trying to restore. He was willing to be wrong in public for 12 years before the data made it undeniable that he was right. He was willing to buy ground that everyone said was worthless and spend a decade proving that worthless was the wrong word. He was willing to be patient in a farming culture that measured success in annual yield reports, in a financial culture that measured it in quarterly returns, in a community culture that measured it in what your neighbors thought of what you were doing. That kind of patience is not easy. It is not comfortable. It requires a certainty about your own understanding that most people do not maintain when the people around them are consistently signaling that they are wrong. August maintained it because his father had taught him something about soil that he trusted more than he trusted the consensus of the county fair coffee counter. And because the data, his own careful data, kept in his own careful ledger, was telling him every year that the direction was right, even when the results were not yet visible to anyone else. The ground is still there, still dark, still producing, still fed the county that once laughed at the man who bought it. If this story stayed with you today, drop one word in the comments that describes August Brenner. Just one word. Share this with someone who is doing the slow, patient work that nobody around them understands yet, who needs to hear that 12 years of being right before anyone else can see it is still being right. And subscribe if you haven't already. These are the stories that deserve to be told, and I want you here for every one of them.